Hello again. This is Pastor Tim Brewer coming to you from Lib Bend and Lomita United Methodist Churches, sharing a podcast with you basically about the Bible. I figured that there's probably not enough knowledge about the Bible. There's a difficulty in understanding as what we read. So when somebody wants to understand more about their faith, to have questions, they go to the Bible, but the Bible is not a simple thing that gives you just a simple answer. You have to wrestle with it. You have to come to some kind of understanding. I think you have to do it in community so that other people can reflect on what they're reading as well. It was from a different time, a different culture, a different language, so it's hard to understand. So we've been doing great themes of the Bible. Now we're doing some of the different parts of the Bible. We began with Genesis, and now we're going to do Exodus today. And so Exodus is really the big, other than creation, is the big event for the Jewish faith. The people had gone into Egypt as a sanctuary, as Joseph had provided a space for them to be able to survive and thrive. But as sometimes happens, people are suspicious of outsiders. They're fearful of them. They don't know their customs. They don't understand them, and so they tend to try to keep them down, keep them from being a threat. And that happened in Egypt. And so there needed to be somebody to be a rescuer, savior, so to speak, of the Hebrew people. And it turned out, as you know, the story of Moses, the prince of the Nile, the prince of Egypt, who they were killing the Hebrew children, and he was floated in a basket and picked up by a princess of the Pharaoh, and so raised as her own, raised as a prince of Egypt, but his temper got the best of him, and he ended up having to leave because he killed one of the Egyptians in defense of a Hebrew. But God was not finished with him. God called him with the burning bush. He said, I've heard my people and I need to send somebody down there. It's amazing how God usually sends a person when something needs to be done. And as Moses, as many prophets have done, he objected. He said he wasn't qualified. He didn't have the skills. He didn't have the personality. He shouldn't be the one to go. But God always tends to pick the least likely, the ones who can use their disadvantage to their advantage. So he sends down Moses. So this unknown person comes to talk to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is not willing to let the Hebrew slaves go. That's a source of his power. That's a source of his wealth. And he's not likely to let the labor force go. And so they have the 10 plagues. Interestingly enough, they were just not random plagues, but each one was dealing with a different Egyptian god. So they were proving that God, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, was more powerful than all the Egyptian gods. And the last plague was the death of the firstborn. The future of any civilizations depend on their children. If the children cease to exist, then the civilization cease to exist. And so this was really the most difficult thing for Pharaoh to deal with. But the idea was that the angel of death would pass over and the firstborn of all the Egyptians would die. To keep that happening from the Hebrews, they took a lamb's blood and put it on the doorway so the angel of death would pass over. And they were to eat their meal getting ready to leave, not letting the bread rise, and eating with their bags packed and their shoes on and ready to go. And that began Passover, which became one of the central celebrations of the Jewish faith about who they were and where they came from. They left, and first with Pharaoh's blessing, and then he changed his mind and sent the army after them, and they were confronted with the Red Sea that was a division between them and the wilderness where they were going. And we know the story from the movies, many of the movies in television shows that had the waters parted and the Hebrews following. I don't know what it looked like if there had been cameras there, but I knew that the Hebrew people were walking and were taking much lighter, less supplies, and the Egyptian army, which bogged down their chariots, wouldn't go through the mud, and so they end up getting through out into the wilderness. Then Moses had to lead them around the wilderness. It was a time in which they were formed as a people, when they remembered who they were, that they began to have a relationship with each one another and form customs and practices. So they spent 40 years in the wilderness, but they didn't really have to, because when they got close to the promised land, they sent in spies, 12 spies, and 10 of them said, well, it's a wonderful land, but there are giants in the land. We've got to be fearful of being able to conquer, that we can't do it. We're not strong enough. We're not big enough. In essence, say that God's not trustworthy. 2 said we can do it, but they believed the minority report. And so they ended up walking around the wilderness for 40 years until all that generation had passed away before they entered the promised land. Along the way, they ran out of water and they ran out of food, and because there's a large group of people in the wilderness, Moses had to strike a rock so that a spring came up, and they were able to get water, and they had manna from heaven, which is the Hebrew word manna means what is this stuff? It's flaky stuff that came down from at night, and they were able to subsist on it while they're in the Holy Land, while they're going to the Holy Land. But in the wilderness, God gave them the 10 Commandments, which can be described as a minimum requirements for living together. If you don't trust somebody to steal your stuff or to do damage to you, then you can't be a neighbor. And so these are the requirements for living together. It's for our own benefit. It's not for our restriction, but to help us out, be human beings. So during that time, Moses learned a lot as well, how to delegate. He was trying to do it all himself, and he figured out how to delegate. And he came down with the 10 Commandments, and they were worshiping the golden calf, and Moses was really done with them. And he went to God and complained, but God was willing to give up on those folks and let Moses start again. But Moses talked him out of it, saying to stay with us, even though we don't do very well sometimes. That God hangs with us, and that's one of the lessons of the wilderness is that God stays with us during the good times and during the hard times. It's not all pleasant and easy. Sometimes life is just difficult, but God never abandons us. So right on the edge of the promised land, Moses' life comes to an end, and he has to let Joshua lead into that wilderness. It really wasn't something that he did as much as they need a different kind of leadership. Leading people through the wilderness is very different than leading them into a settlement, into established governments, and into establishing tribal lands. And so it really required something different. So Joshua came up. God provides leadership for the time and place that's necessary. But this faithfulness of God, the God to deliver them out of Egypt, out of whatever difficulty that they find themselves, not on their timetable, but on God's timetable when it's right. And that's what the event of Exodus and the book of Exodus has to tell us. So next time we'll begin delving into some of the more difficult books. Those are Genesis and Exodus are stories. They're easier to read. Now we get into some of the more difficult things of the scriptures. I'll see you next time.